News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moskow.
Karen, we begin with the latest developments in the Middle East. The war has entered a fifth day of fighting, and there are no signs of easing. Israel says it's striking Iranian targets as well as Hezbollah sites in Lebanon as Iran continues to fire missiles at Arab states across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia says there was just an attempt this morning on one of its key refineries at Ras Tanura. The kingdom says there was no damage. We get the latest from Bloomberg Middle East managing editor Paul Wallace.
This conflict continues and there's no sign of let-up from Iran or the US or Israel. The latter two continue to strike Iran heavily, and Iran is striking back very intensely against Gulf Arab states. It seems at the moment as if Iran is concentrating most of its power on those Gulf Arab states rather than Israel, the likes of the UAE, the likes of Saudi Arabia. The sense is very much that Iran is using its drones now, of which it has far more than it does cruise and ballistic missiles to target Gulf Arab states.
Bloomberg's Paul Wallace says the State Department has now announced plans to help evacuate Americans who want to leave the Middle East.
Well, Nathan, President Trump said the U.S. would provide insurance guarantees and naval escorts to ensure safe passage for oil tankers and other vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not having too much impact on the oil market. Right now, crude is up again. NYMEX crude oil is at $76.61 a barrel. Brent is at $83.80. Meanwhile, the president said he ordered the attack on Iran because he thought Tehran was about to attack first and that Israel did not force his hand to initiate the air assaults. Trump spoke yesterday at the Oval Office.
Based on the way the negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first, and I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand, but Israel was ready and we were ready.
President Trump is threatening to cut off all trade with Spain after that country denied the U.S. access to its military bases for the campaign against Iran. The president says he has already instructed Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to sever the relationship.
I told Scott to cut off all dealings with Spain. They were the only country that in NATO would not agree to go up to 5%. I don't think they would have agreed to go up to anything. They wanted to keep it at 2%, and they don't pay the 2%. So we're going to cut off all trade with Spain.
A Spanish government official said that the U.S. must respect international trade agreements and the autonomy of private companies.
And more world leaders are speaking out about the war, Karen. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is criticizing the U.S. and Israel for striking Iran without consulting allies or the United Nations.
The current conflict is another example of the failure of the international order. Despite decades of UN Security Council resolutions, the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and a succession of sanctions and diplomatic frameworks, Iran's nuclear threat remains. And now, the United States and Israel have acted without engaging the UN or consulting with allies, including Canada.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke earlier in Sydney.
And Nathan, in Europe, UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves says Britain will not make decisions about Iran based on U.S. trade ties. Speaking to Bloomberg, Reeves explained why the government was not taking part in the strikes on Tehran.
When it comes to decisions around using British armed forces to take part in conflicts around the world, it is very important that we judge those on whether it is legal and whether it is the right thing to do. You can't make a decision about whether to get British armed forces involved in a conflict because it may or may not make it more likely to get a trade deal.
And Rachel Reeves was speaking to Bloomberg after President Trump criticized Prime Minister Keir Starmer over the UK's limited support.
Let's turn to politics now, Karen. Back here in the U.S., the results are in from the first primary races in the 2026 midterm elections. In Texas, four-term Republican Senator John Cornyn is headed to a runoff with State Attorney General Ken Paxton.
The people of Texas made your voices heard. After all the personal attacks, which there were many, and after all the lies, you listened to what John Cornyn was selling, and you weren't buying it.
And with 88% of ballots counted, Ken Paxton trails Senator Cornyn by 1 percentage point, 40.9 to 41.9%. Republican Congressman Wesley Hunt received 13.4% of the votes, denying either candidate a majority. That means Cornyn and Paxton will face off again in May.
Well, Nathan, in the closely watched Democratic Senate primary, State Representative James Talarico defeated Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett 53.1 to 45.6%. But the vote was marked by confusion in Crockett's home base of Dallas County. Voters there and in at least one other county reported being turned away from polling places due to a rule change that required them to vote at their local precinct. In past elections, they could vote anywhere in the county. A judge extended the voting by 2 hours, but Crockett says her heart is broken.
We were able to keep the polls open, but I can tell you now that people have been disenfranchised.
Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett says the result could hinge on who was or was not allowed to vote in Dallas County. Talarico also blamed Republicans for the rule change and called for voting hours to be extended.
Programming note here now, Karen, as we've just seen this past weekend, markets may close on Friday, but the world doesn't. And that is why we're bringing you a new live radio and TV show. Bloomberg this weekend looks beyond the daily headlines to the bigger themes driving politics, business, and culture. Join David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo for smart conversations and in-depth interviews that help make sense of the week that's been and what comes next. Get Bloomberg This Weekend live Saturdays and Sundays from 7 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app.
And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moskow.
I'm Nathan Hager, and this is Bloomberg.